Organisms of Cobra-La, detach and defend to the death.
Hi guys, welcome back. As most people know, the G.I. Joe franchise is the thing with soldiers, lasers, tanks, ninjas, and Cobra trying to take over the world every other week. But then G.I. Joe the movie happened in 1987, and suddenly the franchise introduced a 40,000-year-old ancient ruler hiding under the Himalayas, whose body was rebuilt through living biotechnology, crustacean-like armor, organic mutation, and a giant snake tail. He wanted to devolve humanity back into primitive life forms, and his name was Golobulus. Now, once you actually start looking at what his body was, how it functioned, and how much of him was still technically human, he becomes one of the creepiest villains 80s animation ever created. So without further ado, let's take a look at Golobulus's anatomy.
Know that I am Golobulus, supreme ruler of this kingdom of Cobra-La.
Who is Golobulus? Before we even get into the anatomy, we need to establish what Golobulus actually is. Because to be honest, a lot of people still misunderstand this character. Now, Golobulus was the supreme ruler of Cobra-La, which was an ancient civilization that existed long before modern humanity. According to the movie, Cobra-La ruled Earth around 40,000 years ago during the Ice Age, which eventually forced them underground beneath a giant hidden region in the Himalayas. So while humans were still figuring out basic survival, Cobra-La had already advanced biotechnology, and that's the most important word here, biotechnology. It wasn't robotics, it wasn't magic, and it wasn't alien technology. Everything Cobra-La created was alive. Their weapons were living organisms, their defenses were alive, and their entire civilization was basically one giant biological ecosystem. And Golobulus himself was the ultimate example of that philosophy. He didn't look like a giant snake-human monster because of some curse or failed experiment. He looked like that because, over centuries, he intentionally rebuilt and altered his own body piece by piece using Cobra-La biotechnology. That meant every strange thing about him was a design by choice. That snake tail? Chosen. The living armor? Chosen. The organic eye? Chosen. The biomechanical alterations? Also chosen. Golobulus basically spent centuries turning himself into a biological superorganism because Cobra-La believed biology was superior to machines. And to be fair, that already kind of makes him way more disturbing than a normal cartoon villain. How much of his original body is still left? Now we'll get into the most important fact about Golobulus. According to the official lore, Golobulus modified and replaced so much of his body over the centuries that almost nothing original remained except parts of his brain and central nervous system. Now think about that for a second. The original parts left of him are his brain and central nervous system, and that's basically it. Everything else has been replaced, altered, or rebuilt, such as his limbs, his lower body, his armor, his sensory organs, and possibly even most of his internal organs. Golobulus is basically the biological version of the ship of Theseus. If you replace every single part of a person except the brain, are they still supposed to be the same person? Technically, yes. Maybe not. That's what makes him creepy, because the lore quietly implies that Golobulus has spent so long replacing himself that his original humanoid form has almost disappeared completely. At this point, his brain is basically trapped inside an engineered ecosystem made out of other living species. And now imagine what that would feel like. Your mind is still conscious, but your body no longer seems to function like a normal human body. Your senses don't work the same way, neither does your movement, and the way you physically touch the world isn't really human anymore. And after 40,000 long years, Golobulus probably doesn't even remember what a normal human body must feel like. What is his body armor made of? Now let's talk about the thing everybody notices first, which is the armor. That's because Golobulus doesn't simply wear armor, his armor is basically alive. And again, the lore describes his armor as genetically engineered mutations of lobsters and crabs fused into his body, each designed for a different defensive purpose. That is honestly one of the most insane sentences that was ever written for a toy file card. His armor plates are literally living crustacean-style organisms fused into his body, and this explains why his armor looks so weird in the movie. It doesn't really look manufactured, it looks organic. And that's because it actually is. The shells are basically symbiotic organisms attached to him directly, and biologically, that is terrifyingly efficient. See, normal armor has weaknesses. Metal dents, plastic cracks, and Kevlar can wear down, but living tissue can actually heal. That means Golobulus's armor may have been able to regenerate damage over time. If a shell plate cracked, the organism may have had the capability to repair itself. If sections became weak, new tissue could grow. And because different shell organisms were engineered for different functions, certain areas of his body probably had different protection levels. Maybe there was thicker shell plating near vital organs, more flexible plating near joints, and sharper growths near combat zones. It was basically adaptive biological armor. Another thing people forget is how uncomfortable this would probably feel for anyone standing near him. Imagine listening to tiny clicking movements from time to time as the shell organisms shift against each other, with parts of the armor subtly moving on their own because they're technically alive. The movie never focused on this outright, but once you know the armor is biological, every scene with Golobulus suddenly feels even more disturbing, because now you're not looking at just armor anymore, you're actually looking at attached life forms. And honestly, the scariest part might just be the possibility that the armor is not fully separate from him anymore. After thousands of years, the shell organisms may have completely integrated into his nervous system, which means when the armor gets damaged, Golobulus might actually feel it. It isn't like metal getting dented. It's almost like flesh getting wounded, and that would mean his body protection and his actual body are basically the same thing. Once you realize the armor's alive, Golobulus becomes less like a person wearing equipment and more like a walking ecosystem.
No one. No.
Why does Golobulus look like a living chimera? One of the strangest details about Golobulus is that his body doesn't look like it belongs to one species. That's actually the whole point. He's not simply half human and half snake. He is a biomechanical chimera made from multiple forms of life stitched together into one functioning body. He has the remains of a human brain and central nervous system, a serpentine lower half, crustacean-style armor, organic sensory modifications, and a body plan that looks like it was grown instead of built. That means Cobra-La wasn't just experimenting with animals. They were engineering across different biological systems and forcing those systems to communicate with each other. And that's actually crazy. Now here's the real interesting part. How does a body like this even receive signals from a human nervous system? Because crustaceans, snakes, and humans don't move or sense the world in the exact same way. So Cobra-La had to engineer some kind of biological interface that allowed human neural signals to control non-human tissue. And to be honest, that might just be one of the most advanced things Cobra-La ever created, because even modern prosthetics struggle with direct nerve integration. Golobulus had solved that problem 40,000 years ago using living organisms. So once again, Golobulus was using biology to solve problems machines usually solve. Everything about Cobra-La came back to that philosophy. Life itself was the technology. How does Golobulus's organic eye actually work? Golobulus's right eye area was also heavily altered, and it appeared to be covered or replaced by some form of organic hybrid tissue. Now this gets really interesting once you think about Cobra-La's design logic. If that replacement was inspired by invertebrate biology, then Golobulus may not have seen the world like a normal human at all. A lot of crustaceans and insects use compound eyes. Instead of one lens like humans, compound eyes are made up of many smaller visual units working together. That gives certain advantages, such as wider vision, better motion detection, and improved awareness of movement. So if Golobulus's altered eye functioned even partially like a compound eye, then he probably saw the world very differently from a human. He may have had a wider field of vision, he may have been able to detect movement faster, and he might have noticed tiny shifts in motion that normal humans would completely miss. And again, look at Cobra-La's design logic. Crustacean-like organisms for armor because shells are strong. Serpentine biology for movement and intimidation. Organic modification for sensory enhancement. Every body part of him was chosen for a reason. Golobulus wasn't random, he was optimized, which honestly makes him even scarier because this wasn't really an accident, this was engineering. Why does he have a snake tail? Now we get to the most iconic part of Golobulus, which is his giant serpentine lower body. Instead of legs, Golobulus has a massive snake-like tail. And no, this isn't just visual design. This completely changes how he functions physically. A serpentine body gives him advantages a normal human body doesn't really have. For one thing, stability. A coiled snake tail creates a massive anchored base. That means Golobulus can support his upper body much more efficiently than a human standing on two legs. Second is mobility. Snake-like movement allows fast lateral motion. He can shift directions quickly, slide across terrain, wrap around targets, and probably even move silently. Third is constriction. A tail that size could absolutely crush a human body if used in combat, especially if it was genetically engineered by Cobra-La. Now, maybe the most important thing is psychological intimidation. Humans are naturally uncomfortable around serpentine movement, and the movie uses that perfectly. Golobulus doesn't move like a human. He glides, he coils, he towers over everybody, and the second he appears on screen, he already feels unnatural. Replacing his entire lower body is probably the biggest modification Cobra-La ever performed on him. Armor is one thing, the eyes are another thing, but replacing his entire locomotion system means abandoning the human body plan completely. At that point, you're not just upgrading yourself anymore, you're becoming an entirely different species altogether. How has he survived for 40,000 years? Now we move on to the immortality question. Golobulus has apparently been alive since before modern human civilization. The file card implies that his immortality came from a symbiotic biological process that slowly stripped away his humanity over time. That line is honestly the entire character, because his body basically functions like a constantly renewing ecosystem. Individual components die, then they get replaced. Armor organisms regenerate. Damaged biological parts get swapped out. Meanwhile, the original brain and central nervous system remain protected at the center. So biologically speaking, Golobulus is not immortal because his body never ages. He is immortal because his body never stops replacing itself. That's actually closer to real biology than people think, because your body is already replacing cells constantly. Skin cells die, blood cells regenerate, and tissue repairs itself. Golobulus just pushed that principle to an insane science fiction extreme. He's basically a permanent nervous system housed inside replaceable living hardware. And after thousands upon thousands of years, the hardware became less human every time it got replaced. Now think about the amount of time we're talking about here. 40,000 years. Human civilization as we know it was not even close to existing yet. Entire empires rose and collapsed while Golobulus was still alive underground. Languages disappeared. Religions formed, countries emerged, and technology evolved from stone tools to satellites. And throughout all of that, Golobulus just kept replacing parts and surviving, which honestly makes him feel less like a villain and more like some ancient biological relic that refused to die. And psychologically, immortality on that scale probably destroys your connection to normal life, because after enough centuries, humans would start looking temporary to you. More fragile, more short-lived, and more insignificant. That might actually explain why Golobulus talks about humanity almost like an infestation instead of a species. He is so old that modern civilization probably feels like a brief interruption in Earth's history. And that's exactly why the file card says he lost his humanity, because immortality slowly transformed him into something else.
Organisms of Cobra-La, detach and defend to the death.
How dangerous is Golobulus in combat? Here's the interesting thing about Golobulus. He isn't dangerous only because he's physically powerful. He is dangerous because every part of his body is designed for survival. Now, there aren't many clean official combat statistics for him, so we shouldn't pretend he's some tank-lifting comic book god. But look at the full package. He has a massive reach advantage, a huge constricting tail, living armor, regenerative biology, altered sensory systems, and a body specifically engineered for longevity. That itself is already terrifying, but then the movie adds another layer. Golobulus doesn't just control his own body, he commands Cobra-La's entire living ecosystem. Plants attack on command, creatures emerge from walls, organic defenses activate throughout the dome, and it's almost as if the environment itself obeys him. Hence, fighting Golobulus inside Cobra-La isn't just fighting one enemy, It's like fighting a living civilization with him at the center. And to be honest, that's probably why he works better as a biological overlord than a simple hand-to-hand boss. What are the devolution spores? Now let's talk about the most horrifying thing in the entire movie, the devolution spore. Golobulus doesn't just want to kill humanity, he wants to reverse human evolution. The spores are biological weapons that mutate living beings into primitive forms, and the movie shows this happening slowly to Cobra Commander. At first, he mutates, then his body slowly becomes more reptilian. Eventually, he fully transforms into a snake. That is honestly a nightmare for a kids' movie. Golobulus planned to spread these spores across the entire planet using the BET system, basically turning Earth's atmosphere into one giant mutation cloud. Now, the movie never directly says that the spores come from Golobulus's body itself. They seem to be products created by Cobra-La biotechnology. But psychologically, they still feel like extensions of his ideology because Golobulus understands and controls them better than anybody. The terrifying part is how casually he uses them. To him, devolving humanity is not evil, it is correction. He genuinely sees humans as inferior creatures who stole the planet from Cobra-La, which means the devolution spores are not just weapons, they are tools for restoring what he believes is the natural order. And to be honest, that mindset makes him even scarier than the mutations themselves. But the spores are also terrifying because of what they say about Cobra-La's understanding of biology. Think about what these things actually do. They don't just poison people, they rewrite them. That means Cobra-La somehow understands genetics, mutation, and biological regression at a level that is far beyond modern science. The scariest part is that the process appears at least partially controllable. Golobulus transforms Cobra Commander into a snake because he sees him as weak and treacherous. That's not just random mutation, that is targeted biological punishment. That honestly makes Cobra-La feel less like a hidden civilization and more like a species of living genetic engineers. And once you realize that, Golobulus becomes even more disturbing because his own body might basically be the greatest experiment Cobra-La had ever created. Can Golobulus actually be killed? Despite how ancient and monstrous Golobulus is, he shouldn't be treated as completely invincible. This is important because a lot of people assume he's unkillable, but the lore doesn't really prove that. His immortality protects him from aging, not necessarily from physical destruction. His armor can absorb damage, his body may regenerate certain parts, and his symbiotic systems keep him functioning far longer than he is supposed to, but that doesn't he can't be harmed. The movie also shows that Golobulus has limits. Lieutenant Falcon, Jinx, and Sergeant Slaughter are able to confront him and his forces during the climax, and once the BET system is turned against the spore pods, Cobra-La's entire plan collapses. That tells you that Golobulus's biggest weakness seems to be dependency. He relies heavily on Cobra-La's ecosystem, which is the thing keeping his symbiotic systems and power structure functioning at maximum efficiency. Take away the dome, destroy the living infrastructure, remove the biological support network, and suddenly Golobulus is no longer the ruler of a perfect organic empire. He is a heavily modified ancient organism with no repair environment. That makes sense because every ecosystem has vulnerability, and Golobulus was basically an ecosystem pretending to be a person.
Organisms of Cobra-La, detach and defend.
What happens to him at the end? At the end of G.I. Joe the movie, Falcon reconfigures the BET system and destroys the Spore Gods. The resulting energy blast destroys Cobra-La's plan. The dome begins collapsing, the biological infrastructure falls apart, and everything starts dying. But here's the interesting part. The movie never clearly shows Golobulus dying. His fate is left ambiguous, and honestly, that might be the creepiest possible ending for him. Think about what this character already survived. The Ice Age, 40,000 years underground, the collapse of his civilization's dominance over Earth, and massive biological transformation. So the movie leaves the possibility open that maybe he survived again. But at the same time, Cobra-La's destruction may have finally killed him because once the ecosystem supporting his immortality disappeared, maybe his body could no longer sustain itself. And to be honest, both possibilities are very disturbing. If he died, then Golobulus spent 40,000 years rebuilding himself only for everything to collapse in one final disaster. But if he survived, then somewhere out there is a damaged 40,000-year-old biological nightmare still crawling around with nothing left but survival instinct. And somehow, I feel that might be worse.
No one defies Golobulus and lives.
What did "at the cost of his humanity" really mean? This is the part that makes Golobulus genuinely fascinating, because his file card kept repeating one idea. He achieved immortality at the cost of his humanity. Most people interpret that emotionally, but honestly, I think the line works better anatomically, because think about what parts of him are still human. His brain, his central nervous system, and that's basically it. Everything else that connected him to the world is non-human. He sees through altered organic biology. He moves through serpentine biology. He protects himself using living shell organisms. His consciousness may still be human, but every physical experience surrounding that consciousness has become alien. Now imagine living like that for 40,000 years. Eventually, your idea of how it feels to be human probably disappears. And that's the tragedy of Golobulus. He achieved exactly what most civilizations dream about: immortality, perfect biological adaptation, and control over evolution. But the longer he survived, the less human he became, until eventually the body outgrew the person inside it. By the time we meet him in the movie, Golobulus is not really a man anymore. He is a human nervous system operating a civilization's worth of engineered biology. And honestly, that's what makes him one of the most underrated horror villains of the 1980s. And that's Golobulus, a 40,000-year-old ruler whose original body has almost completely disappeared, leaving behind a human brain and central nervous system buried inside living crustacean-style armor, organic mutation, and a giant serpentine body. He is not a demon. He is not an alien. He is basically the final result of a civilization that believed biology was the greatest technology imaginable and spent thousands of years rebuilding their ruler into something that could survive forever. Whether Golobulus died with Cobra-La or somehow survived its destruction, the idea of him is still disturbing even decades later. Do let us know which part of his anatomy creeped you out the most, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!